What is up, racers, and welcome back to another video companion for an article on Forever F1. It's been a little while since we've done this one. I know the last time I did this, it was not super successful, but I'm excited to bring you some more content based on a new article we posted this week. And just a quick shout out to all those who read the blog recently. It's been doing incredibly well, and I hope that you've had a great holiday season leading into this. Let's just get right into it. So if you're like me, you'll be fascinated with the idea of Toro Rosso and F1. If you're a soccer fan, if you're a baseball fan, there's no such thing as a B team. It just doesn't exist. You have the Yankees, you have their B team, and that exists in an entirely different sphere. They don't exist in the same league. They don't compete against each other. It's not a thing that exists. But in Formula One, of course, we have a ton of them. We have Ferrari and what Haas is going to be. They've just built a new facility in Maranello dedicated to Haas. We've got, of course, Racing Point and Mercedes. We've got Williams and Mercedes. We've got a bunch of different teams that are all focused on just being development teams for those bigger teams. So what happens here is you end up in a scenario in which you have a pipeline. You have the drivers who come through like George Russell to Williams and eventually go to Mercedes. You have people like Max Verstappen who come to this very team that we're going to be talking about today. The Toro Rosso has been an incredible success story, much like Red Bull, where they joined the field as a terrible team. The first year that they competed in Formula One, they scored zero zilch until one fateful race where they scored a single point. But other than that, they scored no points in their first season. A far cry from winning 2 races, multiple podiums this season and last, and they are hosting some of the best drivers in Formula One as things stand. So what I thought I'd do is I'd go back through the history of the team and look for which drivers have really defined the eras. They have had so many impactful drivers, names you'll remember, names that you might not, and those have all been really significant in terms of how we've actually seen things work here. So we're going to look through it and see which has been the best lineup for this team and which one has kind of been a little bit underwhelming. Spoiler alert, it gets better as time goes on. We'll go through it. There's 12 to go through, and we're going to check it out as we can here. All right. We are going to look firstly at Vittorio Liuzzi and Scott Speed. You all know that I'm American. If you don't by now, you can hear my voice enough times. Here, don't want to spoil the next post that's coming up. But now I can talk to you about the first one that happened here. You can see what I've written here, and you can read through it, but what I want to talk about this is just how far they've come, right? This is 2016, so the team technically disbanded in 2019, though it still exists as AlphaTauri, and that means that they've come from Vittorio Liuzzi to Max Verstappen in the course of just 10 years. I mean, what other team can say that? Maybe Force India to Racing Point. Other than that, teams like McLaren have gone down, Williams has gone down, Renault has stayed pretty consistent. As a result, this is probably the team that had the most general success, like in terms of getting better. Red Bull started as a midfield team, became a top team, but Toro Rosso started as really like a Virgin Racing or a Caterham or a HRT. They've come a long way. So what we're really interested in looking at here is how much they changed. Keep in mind who these drivers are. So Scott Speed and Vittorio Liuzzi, no surprises. They are at the back here. They are quite honestly one of the worst driver lineups I've seen in Formula One. They had really no pace, no potential here. Liuzzi was the one who scored that solitary point. Scott Speed, better suited for maybe the American forms of racing like IndyCar and NASCAR, but he just was not ready for that open car experience. Traveling the world, maybe a bit too much for him. I won't rag on him too much. I'm sure he's heard it all before. Here, scrolling down now, we have Vittorio Liuzzi and Sebastian Bourdais. So this was a minor upgrade on the lineup they had for 2016. They got better in 2007, where they got a little bit better, where they added Sebastian Bourdais. So Sebastian Bourdais, what he brought is he brought 4 car championships that he had already. He was actually quite good at things like DTM, or those kind of series that have a lot of former F1 drivers like Paul di Resta or Nico Hülkenberg who come from those series. Bourdais, however, struggled to find his real grounding here. He's definitely better than Scott Speed. I mean, there's really no doubt about that. So there's definitely something to be talked about here. But let's move on because these are kind of very similar lineups, not much to talk about. Now we jump ahead a little bit. We're talking about Sebastian Buemi and another Sebastian, Bourdais again, and Jaime Alguersuari. So this is really the genesis. If you guys are interested in the saga of Alex Albon or Daniil Kyvat, this is where Red Bull became the team known for swapping drivers. It was 2009 where Sebastian Bourdais was underperforming and they terminated the terms of his contract mid-season. Now this was so much of a different circumstance in 2009 than it is right now. And you have to think back to Guido van der Garde to even consider anything else that's like this in modern Formula One. But what happened here was that Sebastian Bourdais was taken out of his seat in the middle of the year and he didn't like that, understandably so, right? So what happens here, he ends up suing the team and settling out of court for 2.1 million US dollars. That is a massive settlement for anything, but especially for an F1 contract where they seem to get broken every other week. And what I think happened past this point is teams started putting those clauses in there. It can be canceled at any time. There's a set amount of settlement that you're going to take. There's a buyout clause, something like that, to make it a little bit easier for them to skirt the terms of their contracts. And what happened here is they just didn't have that. This was entirely new, and they just weren't really the same landscape that we see today in Formula One. As a result of this, they ended up in a scenario in which they were going to have to pay millions of dollars to replace him with Jaime Alguersuari. But given that it's a drinks manufacturer that pulls in billions of dollars a year, they had the cash and they forked it over to get the young driver. Now, Alguersuari is an interesting prospect in F1 because he's one of those guys that did actually pan out. And this is so rare for Red Bull to have someone they think is actually going to be really good and not work. I can think of maybe Bourdais and Alguersuari. That's pretty much it. I mean, Buemi and Vergne didn't do great in F1, but they weren't total flops, unlike Alguersuari and the aforementioned. So what was interesting about this one is they had a good driver in Buemi. He's shown it in Formula E. He's done incredibly well to be up in the title fight, third in the title fight the 2 years ago that he was there. Watched him in New York, super rapid driver. But he just didn't cut it super well in F1. And you can see a little bit the next part of what we're going to talk about. No reason to not spoil it for you because it's basically the same lineup. But I would say that Alguersuari on balance was a better driver than Bourdais was. So as a result of that, I'm going to say that Alguersuari and Bourdais as a secondary piece to Buemi is better. But moving on, we end up in 2010 or 2011. Now this is when I kind of started to get really into Formula One. You know, I'm a young guy, so obviously it was kind of hard to get in it any earlier than that. But this is an awesome lineup. This is a lineup that looks like the kind of quintessential Toro Rosso for what I'm talking about. This is your two drivers who are sort of mediocre, pulling up the field, ready to get things done. And what the thing here was that this is kind of where it changed. This is where Toro Rosso became a midfield team. You added the teams like Virgin, Caterham, and HRT, and you couldn't say that Toro Rosso was a backmarker anymore. And of course, compared to those, you know, maybe that's a little bit generous, but still, that was when they kind of had a new identity. You know, Franz Tost really took the team around. I remember him getting back-to-back Team Boss of the Year awards, and I think it was 2011, 2012. And that really changed the whole nature of the game. Like, we're talking about a team that's now looking for things like we want to get up the field, we want to push for things like fighting against Lotus at the time, or we want to go and fight against teams like what would eventually become like Sport Pacer Racing, which became Racing Point. They were really looking to actually move up the field. This is a new direction for Toro Rosso. Rather than just a development squad, they're trying to figure out how to be a better team as a whole. And what happened here is you end up in a circumstance in which they outgrew their driver. So Buemi and Alguersuari were good for the place that Toro Rosso were in 2010, but you'll see that when they get to 2012, it wasn't good enough because they were an established team that was looking to push for things like 6th place, 5th place, and eventually, as you can see in what we see now, is they're in 7th place, but they're still, you know, scoring consistent points. They scored a win this year, podiums, etc., etc. They're always getting better until they get to the point where they got to this year. So what we're looking at here is a driver lineup that got outgrown by the car itself. Super rare to see that because there aren't that many teams that grow as quickly as Toro Rosso have, but they did an excellent job of holding on the fort in 2010, 2011. A good lineup. No reason to think that they're not. Sorry, I think I've spoiled number 7, but you can look at number 8, and I think there might be some contention about what this looks like here. This is why I wanted to do a video component of this particular article. So Pierre Gasly, I think personally, is the best Toro Rosso driver of all time. Controversial, I know. It deserved a pause. But what is important here to note is that Gasly has been with Toro Rosso longer than most drivers. I mean, most drivers take 2 years and then get kicked the boot. I remember it was a joke in like 2015 that you get your 2-year Toro Rosso driver's license, and if you haven't made it to Red Bull in that time, you're gone, right? And Sainz is maybe the exception to that, where he moves to another team. Other than that, you're gone from F1. This happened to Buemi, it happened to Vergne, it happened to Bourdais, etc., Alguersuari, and this is where Pierre comes in, because Pierre has been an excellent driver for Toro Rosso for almost 3 years now, and we have his, you know, sort of small stint with Red Bull, which lasted, you know, maybe the decent chunk of a year. I think it was 12 races until Vettel that season, and everything other than that, his entire career, think about that, has been with Toro Rosso. So an entire season, let's say half a season to be generous, and another season with AlphaTauri / Toro Rosso. So he has been the longest tenured driver, apart from Vergne, for Toro Rosso ever. That is crazy to think about. And in that time, he's been super successful. Of course, he scored a win, he scored podiums, and he's been the most consistent driver in terms of pushing that car above where it should be. As a result, then, he is the GOAT of this team. I'll talk more about why he's not at the top here, but there's other lineups I think are better. And for Brendan Hartley, I know there's a lot of fans who are super hyped on Brendan Hartley, and I feel so bad saying bad things about him. I know there's a lot of New Zealand fans, Australian fans who might also feel some sympathy, who really want to see this guy succeed. I do too, and I'm super glad that he's doing well in the series that he's moved into. Unfortunately, in F1, I cannot use any objective statements to say he was a great driver. He just didn't put things together. And the fact is that he was unlucky. I've said it in the article here. You can go read it. It's going to be in the description below. But he also was just not the right guy for F1. I think he just came in too late. He was already in his late 20s, early 30s, I think he was. And he just wasn't ready to adapt to the car. So the truth is, in reality, this is Pierre holding this lineup above all else. If it wasn't, you know, if Pierre wasn't the driver if this was Danny Kyvat, I might even put this behind, like, Buemi and Alguersuari. Like, this might be 11th. It wouldn't be worse than Scott Speed. It might not be better than Buemi and Alguersuari. The point is, Pierre Gasly is an amazing driver, intense racer for Toro Rosso, best they've ever had. Brendan Hartley, extremely unlucky, would have loved to see another season with him in the car. Just based on what we have, guys, just based on what we have, they're going to be number 8. Number 7, I spoiled this for you already, Daniil Kyvat, Alex Albon. This is the one I wanted to make this video for. This is the one I was super excited to talk about. Alex Albon, such an enigma. How do you place him on the field? Is he a bad driver in a good car that's just a little bit too good for him? Is he a good driver in a car that doesn't fit his style? Or is he just kind of a mediocre driver who's been like run into this Red Bull machine that he was nowhere near prepared for? I kind of think it's the third one. I think Alex Albon is a great midfield driver. I think he's not cut out for the top level of the sport. Look, most drivers aren't. Most of us in the world aren't. There's no shame in that. But it's also really difficult to say that he's bad. I mean, look at his career. He's got a lot of points, got a lot of podiums. It's difficult to go against that. Who's a great foil for that? Danny Kyvat, someone who actually succeeded at Red Bull for most of his time there, but was taken out unfairly. This seems like such a match made in heaven in that way, the storyline of it, with the old guard and the rising star. The difficulty with this lineup is that they were kind of in this weird moment in Red Bull's history, right? We have an area in which Pierre Gasly is there. He's not doing well. This is the first time you've had a driver come in and not do well. Like, even Danny Kyvat had a great time with Red Bull in that first season. He beat Daniil Ricciardo famously, who had a lot of engine issues and such like that, but he beat him, and that's enough because, right, like, you have enough points that you need to get forward, and obviously 2014 was a terrible year for Red Bull, especially compared to what they've been doing for the last 4 years. But when you got there was a guy who was ready to come in and do the business. He really did. He came in and he made enough points for them to succeed. He didn't get any race wins, but they didn't really do that much that season anyway. And he did beat Daniil Ricciardo. That's something that they needed. They saw Vettel bow out pretty ungraciously from Red Bull, and that was in 2015 that he moved over. So Danny Kyvat would have been there in 2015, not 2014. But that was an immense moment in the history of the team. First time after they've won, 4 championships, things kind of went into turmoil, and that really just kind of sent things rolling into a sort of the cluster mess that we'll talk about a little bit later here. So when we talk about this, I also want to mention that we're going to talk about the 6th best lineup. It's going to make people a little bit confused. This is Danny Kyvat in 2019. Know that he was kind of extremely demotivated that year. I mean, he got beat by Alex Albon in points. I think Danny Kyvat is probably still the better driver, but you can imagine how demoralized he was. Drawn back into Formula 1 by the same team that kicked him out. It just couldn't have felt great. You can't say no to a Formula 1 seat. Everyone knows that, but what a difficult situation to be in. Danny Kyvat in his 2019 iteration, not great. Let's be honest, probably bottom 5 driver on the grid, maybe bottom 3 that year. I would have to go back and look at it, but he was really low on pace. I think it was just a motivation issue. We've seen how well he can do when it comes to it. And of course, in 2019, he did get that podium, which is awesome to see, but in general, he just was not at his best. His best is kind of what I'm looking for. And I'm not sure that was 2019, excuse me on that. Number 6, and a little picture to tease you as we move into the modern era of things. Jean-Eric Vergne and Danny Kyvat. So some of you might say, you can't be serious. How is Vergne better than Albon? Well, let me explain here, right? We're looking at a driver for their skill, and I think that on balance, Vergne is a better driver, which is largely based on his success in Formula E, I will admit. But over the course of his 3-year tenure with Toro Rosso, again, the second most, or tied first most, longest tenured driver at Toro Rosso, great guy. I mean, he just did the business. He was there. He was good. They didn't even think about replacing him. He left. I think he's the only driver to willingly leave Toro Rosso just out of the sport. That's something that just didn't happen and doesn't happen to this day. So that is something that's worth mentioning. I think Vergne was deserving of a better seat. I think Lotus would have earned a great place for him at that time and place. But unfortunately, they just went with Kyvat. They really appreciate youth at Red Bull. It's kind of an interesting strategy. I'm not really sure why, because they're a team that wins now. They have success, and especially in 2014, they were at the top of the grid. But that's what they want. They always want the younger driver. They're going to take it. I mean, Sergio Perez is the one exception, but they're looking to replace him with Tsunoda in 22 anyway. So such a weird situation, guys. I'm not really sure why they did that, but Vergne, great driver. Kyvat was coming in. He was hungry. This is the Kyvat that also went on to beat Ricciardo the next season. That's the Kyvat who's going to be the best iteration of that driver. And as a result of that, you got to say that Danny Kvyat beats Danny Kvyat. Very simple. And Alex Albon, I think, is just too early in his F1 career to say that he truly is a better driver than Vergne. I think Vergne in the same Red Bull would do as good, if not a little bit better than Alex Albon has done. Love to hear your comments about that. I know that's a controversial opinion. Number 5, Carlos Sainz Jr. and Daniil Kvyat. Again, we're kind of like running through some lineups that are marginally changed. I'll just say that Carlos Sainz is better than Charles Vergne. That shouldn't be controversial. Ferrari and a Red Bull driver, absolutely awesome. Good thing to see. Moving down, we're going to get with Daniel Ricciardo and Jean-Eric Vergne. Jev, I think, is a driver that I rate very highly, especially because of his success in Formula E. He's a champion there. He's won many races. He's someone who's beaten better, or rather very good drivers like Andre Lauderer and Antonio Felix da Costa, Sebastian Buemi. He's done very, very, very well. So what happens here is you end up with Daniel Ricciardo, who's a better driver than Carlos Sainz, and you end up with a better lineup. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Anyone who says Carlos Sainz is better than Daniel Ricciardo is kind of suffering from a little bit of recency bias, I think. But there's no reason to say that you're totally wrong about that, although maybe. We'll see. We'll see next season, right? Pierre Gasly and Carlos Sainz. This is one where we talk about Gasly's real skill here, right? I think Gasly and Sainz is such a great matchup. And they were only together for like a couple of races because, in truth, as you'll see in the writing here, Gasly was still competing in Super Formula while also being an F1 driver. I've never heard of this happening before, but Gasly was doing both at the same time. He was flown in from Japan. He would go back and forth. He missed a race to go to Super Formula, which gave Brendan Hartley his debut. Nothing wrong about that. And that was something that was really incredible for them. They really were able to create a new system where they were able to get a driver that was finally someone who they thought really had first team potential. Carlos Sainz they thought did, but just they didn't really rate him too well because Carlos Sainz has more consistency over the kind of flair that they're looking for. But what they got is they got a really good sort of inconsistent driver in Gasly and a really consistent, solid driver in Carlos Sainz. And I think if this lineup had continued, Toro Rosso would be a force to be reckoned with. I would see this lineup not being totally unusual in like a racing point. We're talking about the 4th best team in the grid. Obviously, the 3rd best team in the grid. McLaren would also like this. Red Bull would be a little strange, just given the history of Gasly, but I think both drivers maybe have the pace to do so. Not better than Max. It would be a good time. I think that would be great for the midfield. The other one is Sebastian Vettel and Sebastian Bourdais. This one is difficult, right? Because I think it's tough to place Sebastian Vettel. He was such a good driver in his day, and he was the best, and still is the best prospect that I think Red Bull's ever produced. So when we're talking about the skill of Sebastian Vettel in 2008, and whether it dwarfs Daniel Ricciardo and Vergne together, or Pierre Gasly and Sainz together, I think it doesn't for one reason. I think it's the case because Sebastian Vettel back then was able to take a car that was not that great and put it far beyond what it was able to do. I bet Daniel Ricciardo could do things with the AlphaTauri that I think even Pierre Gasly couldn't do. But what I think Sebastian Vettel could do uniquely was he could take 1 or 2 races and really push it to the absolute limit. We saw this with Ferrari too, right? We saw different races in which he was able to push the car above what he was able to do. Obviously, those mistakes in Germany made things difficult, but between 2015 and 2017, there were certain areas where Sebastian Vettel would just take the car on his own, find a track he liked like Singapore, and just get the job done. What I'm thinking about here then is I think that on balance, Sebastian Vettel is so much of a better driver than these other drivers. I think Ricciardo is maybe on par with him, although I think Sebastian Vettel over his entire career is a better driver. Just based on those championships, the consistency, and also the ability to beat people like Hamilton, which Ricciardo never really did. Then Sebastian Vettel has to be up there. Sebastian Bourdais, a tougher person to really argue for, but Sebastian Vettel in Toro Rosso is such a legend. I think no one would blame you for putting this high up here. I considered it putting it as low as 4th, but I really wanted to highlight how good Sebastian Vettel was here. 2, 3, and 4 really could be switched. Number 1 I don't think can be, but it's an exciting thing to talk about. Definitely a subject that I think more pundits should talk about and go into the history of the team because it's absolutely fascinating. It's so different than anything else. And number 1, quite simply, quite obviously, it's Max Verstappen and Carlos Sainz Jr. This is a lineup that obviously Red Bull would love to have today. I think they wish they would have kept Carlos Sainz on board because they would have saved themselves so much pain between Albon, Kvyat, and now Perez. But the great news is that both of them are now in top teams. Sainz has actually gone into Ferrari, and that is a sign that they have basically made the best driver lineup of all time. The only other driver lineup who's done anything remotely close to this was when Kvyat was at the team, and he also went to Red Bull. That's something that's obviously recognizable. However, the difference is that Sainz has had a successful career across the board in Formula 1. He's gone from Renault to McLaren. He's going to go to Ferrari now. He's really doing a tour of the biggest teams in F1 apart from Mercedes and Red Bull, unfortunately. But the point is that you end up with a driver who's just massively consistent. You cannot pick out a year in Carlos Sainz's career where he was crashing too much, where he was missing out in qualifying on Q3s and Q2s. He's always been exactly where the car is supposed to be and at the top potential of that car. He's been with good teammates like Hülkenberg. He's been with good teammates like Max Verstappen, for example. And when he's competing against people like Lando Norris or Max Verstappen, who are much younger than him, and also people who are considered to be top talents in the sport, he's always there. Like, he's always able to match them. He beat Lando twice in a row on points. He did well against Max Verstappen. I think actually beat him in that year that he was there together. And that means that he's just someone who's going to bring home the points. He's a Kimi Räikkönen. He is a Valtteri Bottas, but probably better than Bottas is relative to Hamilton at least. And that is something that is super invaluable for a team, especially a team like Red Bull. And I think every team wants this sort of lineup. They want someone who's going to bring home the points in massive numbers in every few races, like Max Verstappen, and they want someone who's going to bring the points home consistently. That's going to let team principals sleep better at night. It's going to make everyone in the factory have less anxiety and stress about the races that they're going to, and it's just a nice place to be for anyone involved with a team. I'm sure that all drivers, all team bosses would love to have teammates who let this sort of like life exist, and also people like Max Verstappen thrive off of having someone like that. Like Sebastian Vettel loved having a Mark Webber. Lewis Hamilton undoubtedly loves having a Valtteri Bottas instead of a Nico Rosberg. It actually makes some of your drivers better, and it makes them more comfortable. That's something that's really great for like long-term stability, which obviously teams want to see, so they can invest wisely. They can put most of their money into the car and not in the drivers that they're looking for. It just helps the morale of the entire garage, and that's something that really is going to be invaluable. This is kind of mind games that you don't really think about in most of Formula 1, but the people who live it every single day, they really need to feel like their car is going to consistently do well. They don't want someone like a Grosjean circa 2012, because it just gives them the anxiety. It makes it less likely that you're going to really put 100% into your work if you're always stressing. You have that kind of scarcity mindset and things get a bit more difficult for you. So in reality, it makes the whole team better when you have a lineup that's consistent and good. I think Max Verstappen, if I was a team boss, I would pick this lineup out of all the lineups that Toro Rosso has had. It would be really hard to give up on Sebastian Vettel at such a young age. But I think Max Verstappen, of course, has the pace that I think would show if the car was up to that level. So as a result, I'd say they're the best ones. Okay, guys, I've been rambling for a long time. I hope you've enjoyed sort of this content on a more in-depth thing that I think is super fascinating and super unique to the sport of Formula 1. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please take a chance to go out and check out the blog. If you want to comment on this video on the blog or message me privately on YouTube or on the blog, feel free to. Always love to connect with fans, and I really appreciate your enthusiasm for Formula 1. It's something we all share. I'm just super grateful and humbled to see that people actually support and enjoy the things that I make. Thank you all. Hope you have an awesome holiday season. I'll see you guys even more for more things in 2021. And have a great evening. Race on.